In the early years of the Second World War, German pilots believed the sky belonged to them. They had seen Poland fall in weeks, France collapse in days, and British cities burn under waves of bombers. The Luftwaffe had been built for speed, aggression, and shock. It was a weapon designed to break enemies before they could even react. But by 1943, something began to change in the skies over Europe. Far to the west, across the Atlantic, American factories were working day and night. Assembly lines stretched for miles. Steel, aluminum, fuel, and manpower poured into a single purpose: overwhelming force. While Germany refined tactics and pushed pilots to their limits, the United States focused on one brutal idea: numbers so large they could not be stopped. At first, German pilots laughed at American bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress was big, slow, and impossible to hide. It flew in daylight, in tight formations, almost daring fighters to attack it. To experienced Luftwaffe aces, this looked like suicide. They had shot down bombers before. British raids at night had already proven vulnerable. Surely these American formations would be no different. But when the first truly massive raids appeared over Germany, the laughter faded. One German fighter pilot would later describe a moment he never forgot. He climbed through clouds on full throttle, his engine screaming, his fuel gauge already worrying him. When he broke into clear air above, he expected to see dozens of enemy aircraft. Instead, he froze. The sky was full. Not dozens. Not hundreds. 1,000 American bombers stretched from horizon to horizon, stacked at different altitudes, moving forward like a steel storm. Sunlight reflected off wings and fuselages until the sky itself seemed to shine. Vapor trails crisscrossed above them like scars. Below, escorts waited, circling like wolves. And with all that stood against them, just 40 German fighters. In that moment, the pilot understood something no propaganda minister could hide. This was not a battle. This was arithmetic. German fighter units were elite, but they were few. Each pilot was precious, trained over years, hardened by combat. Every aircraft lost was difficult to replace. Fuel shortages limited training. Spare parts were scarce. Airfields were under constant threat. Meanwhile, the American bombers kept coming, day after day, in numbers that seemed impossible. The Luftwaffe had been designed to support fast campaigns, not defend an entire continent from an industrial giant. Germany simply did not have the resources to fight a war of attrition in the air. And now it was facing exactly that. As the bombers advanced, defensive fire erupted. Thousands of machine guns opened up at once. The air vibrated. Explosions walked through the formations, but they did not stop. Gaps closed. Damaged planes stayed in formation as long as they could. Others fell burning, but the mass behind them continued forward without slowing. The German pilot received the order to attack. He knew the odds. He knew that diving into that formation meant flying into a wall of lead. American gunners were trained, disciplined, and protected by overlapping fields of fire. One mistake, 1 second too long on the approach, and his aircraft would be torn apart. Yet he also knew he had no choice. The fighters went in. Cannons fired. Tracers streaked. Bombers exploded or slipped out of formation, trailing smoke. For moments, it almost felt like old times, like the days when skill and courage could still decide the outcome. But then reality returned. For every bomber destroyed, 10 more pressed on. For every German fighter damaged, there was no immediate replacement. Fuel ran low. Ammunition ran out. The escorts, sleek, fast American fighters, began to close in. The German pilot glanced around and saw empty sky where his comrades had been moments earlier. Some were dead. Some were diving away, engines failing. Some would never make it back. And still the bombers flew on. In that moment, above the heart of Europe, the pilot understood the truth. Germany was not losing because its pilots lacked courage or skill. It was losing because it was being crushed by an enemy that could build aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. This was not defeat by tactics. It was defeat by industry. And once a pilot sees that, once he understands that no amount of bravery can stop 1,000 bombers with 40 fighters, he knows the war in the air is already over. By 1943, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany the way they once had. What had started as confident interceptions over occupied territory had slowly turned into desperate scrambles against numbers that seemed impossible to comprehend. German pilots who had once flown with swagger now climbed into their cockpits with a quiet sense of dread. Every mission briefing sounded the same. Another massive American bomber stream. Another attempt to slow the inevitable. From the ground, observers could see them coming hours before they arrived. The contrails alone told the story. Long white scars stretching across the sky, multiplying until the horizon itself looked wounded. One pilot would later recall that it felt less like facing an enemy force and more like watching a moving city suspended in the air. The bombers flew in disciplined formations, tight, methodical, unhurried. They did not dodge. They did not scatter. They simply came on. German fighter groups launched anyway, because they had to. Orders were orders, but the numbers were crushing. 40 fighters climbing to meet what intelligence estimated at nearly 1,000 bombers. Not rumors, not exaggerations, actual confirmed counts. For pilots trained to fight in pairs and small formations, the scale was mentally overwhelming. There was no flank to exploit, no weak edge to cut into. The formations stretched endlessly, layer upon layer, altitude stacked upon altitude. As they approached, the sound hit first. A deep, rolling thunder, not from engines alone, but from thousands of synchronized machines pushing through the air. It was unlike anything Germany had faced earlier in the war. These were not lightly defended aircraft. Each bomber bristled with guns, overlapping fields of fire designed to turn the sky into a killing zone. The closer the German fighters came, the more violent the air became. Pilots described flying into a wall. Tracers filled the space ahead, crossing at angles that left almost no safe approach path. Attacks had to be fast, direct, and terrifyingly exposed. There was no room for hesitation. 1 second too long, and the cockpit would shatter. One misjudged angle, and the aircraft would simply cease to exist. Even successful passes often ended with damaged planes limping back, if they returned at all. What shocked many German pilots was not just the firepower, but the behavior of the bombers themselves. They did not break formation when attacked. They did not panic when aircraft exploded beside them. Gaps closed almost immediately. The stream kept moving forward, absorbing losses with a cold, mechanical resolve. To a fighter pilot used to causing chaos, this was deeply unsettling. It felt like attacking something that could not feel pain. And then there was the realization that these bombers were not alone. Escort fighters appeared in increasing numbers, flying with confidence deep into German airspace. They did not turn back early. They stayed. They hunted. German pilots who survived the initial bomber attack now found themselves pursued on the return, low on fuel, ammunition spent, aircraft damaged. The sky no longer offered escape. In post-mission debriefs, the mood shifted from tactical analysis to something darker. Pilots spoke openly about exhaustion, about the sense that no amount of bravery could change the math. Even the most aggressive aces began to acknowledge what had once been unthinkable. Germany could not replace losses at this rate. The Americans could. Every bomber shot down seemed to be replaced by 2 more on the next mission. Every lost pilot was irreplaceable experience gone forever. One German pilot later described the moment it truly sank in. He had climbed to intercept with his unit, only to realize that even if every fighter scored multiple kills, it would not matter. The bomber stream was simply too large, too organized, too relentless. This was not a battle meant to be won in the air. It was a demonstration of industrial power, of logistics turned into strategy. As the bombers passed overhead and continued toward their targets, smoke rising behind them, the pilot understood something profound. This was not about courage anymore. It was about capacity, about factories, fuel, training pipelines, and production lines stretching safely beyond enemy reach. In that moment, the war felt decided, even if it would take years to officially end. The fighters returned with fewer aircraft than they had launched. Ground crews counted empty dispersal points. Briefings grew shorter. The questions became fewer. No one needed to explain what had happened. Everyone could see it. The sky itself had delivered the verdict. And as the next bomber stream was already being reported forming across the channel, one truth became impossible to deny. Germany was not being defeated by a single battle, or a single weapon, or a single mistake. It was being overwhelmed, methodically, relentlessly, by numbers so vast that resistance, no matter how brave, could only delay the inevitable. By late 1943, the sky over Europe had become a place no German pilot could misunderstand anymore. It was no longer about individual dogfights or daring interceptions. What confronted the Luftwaffe now was something closer to inevitability. From horizon to horizon, American bombers arrived in numbers that defied belief. Not dozens, not hundreds, but sometimes close to 1,000 aircraft in a single mission, moving together with mechanical discipline, each formation overlapping the next like steel scales on a massive armored beast. For a German fighter pilot scrambling from a frozen airfield, the sight was overwhelming. Engines screamed as he climbed hard, knowing fuel was scarce, knowing replacements were few, knowing training hours had been slashed to keep planes in the air. Ahead of him, the sky was already thick with silver shapes reflecting the morning sun. The bomber stream did not look like an attack. It looked like a moving continent. The pilot understood the math instantly. 40 German fighters against a wall of B-17s and B-24s stretching for miles. Each bomber bristling with machine guns. Each Bach formation designed to protect itself even if escorts were temporarily absent. This was no longer a battle of skill. It was arithmetic. As the German fighters closed in, the bombers did not scatter. They did not panic. They flew straight and level, absorbing losses, because the mission mattered more than survival. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, the industrial heart of Germany lay directly beneath those bomb bays. When the firing started, the air turned lethal. Tracer rounds stitched the sky in every direction. German pilots aimed for engines and cockpits, knowing that to bring down a bomber required precision and courage bordering on suicide. Every second spent lining up a shot increased the chance of being hit by defensive fire from multiple directions at once. Planes exploded midair. Wings tore free. Men bailed out through fire and smoke. But the bomber stream did not slow. For every aircraft destroyed, dozens pushed forward untouched. The formations closed ranks automatically, gaps filled almost instantly, the mass continuing its relentless advance. Then came the escorts. Long-range American fighters. P-47s at first, then increasingly P-51 Mustangs, appeared where German pilots had once hoped the bombers would be vulnerable. They did not circle passively. They hunted. Suddenly, the German pilot was no longer choosing targets. He was being chased. The realization hit hard and unmistakably. This was not a contest Germany could win. Even if every German fighter flew perfectly, even if losses were inflicted at record levels, the United States could replace planes, pilots, fuel, and ammunition faster than Germany could bury its dead. This was industrial warfare in its purest form. The bombers reached their targets anyway. Explosions walked across factories and rail hubs. Oil production collapsed. Transportation networks fractured. Repair crews worked around the clock, only to watch the same targets erased again days later. From the cockpit, from the ground, from command offices deep inside Germany, the message became impossible to ignore. The enemy was not just attacking Germany's cities. They were attacking Germany's future. German pilots continued to fly. They continued to fight. But something fundamental had shifted. Courage could not close the gap anymore. Skill could not erase numerical reality. Innovation came too late, in too few numbers, against an opponent who had already solved the problem at scale. When a German pilot looked into the sky and saw 1,000 bombers escorted by fighters that could follow them all the way to Berlin and back, he did not need a briefing to understand the truth. Germany was not being defeated tactically. It was being overwhelmed. The war had become a demonstration of capacity, of factories, training pipelines, fuel supplies, and logistical depth. And in that contest, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The sky itself had chosen a side, and it was not Germany's. By the time the German pilot climbed back into the cold, thin air over the Reich, the war no longer felt like a contest of skill or courage. It felt like mathematics. Brutal, undeniable mathematics. Ahead of him, the sky was no longer blue. It was filled with silver shapes stretching from horizon to horizon, layer upon layer, wave after wave. Heavy bombers flying in tight formation, their contrails weaving together like scars across the sky. He had seen large formations before. He had fought them over France, over the Channel, over Hamburg and Bremen. But this was different. This was not a raid. This was an invasion of the air itself. 1,000 American bombers. They flew in disciplined boxes, each aircraft overlapping fields of fire with the next. From a distance, they looked slow, almost clumsy, but the pilot knew better. Each one carried multiple heavy machine guns, and together they formed a moving fortress that could shred fighters in seconds. The Americans had learned. They no longer came unprotected. They no longer scattered. They flew like a single organism. His radio crackled with familiar voices. 40 German fighters had been scrambled to intercept. 40, against a force so large it seemed unreal. The numbers alone told a story no propaganda could erase. Even if every German fighter scored multiple kills, even if they flew perfectly, even if luck favored them for once, it would not matter. There were simply too many bombers, too many crews, too much industrial power behind them. As he pushed the throttle forward, the pilot felt no excitement. No ruse, only a heavy calm. He thought of the early years when the Luftwaffe ruled the skies, when German pilots chose when and where to fight, when fuel was plentiful, aircraft were new, and replacements were well-trained. That world was gone. Now the engines coughed more often. Spare parts were scarce. Training hours had been cut. Young pilots arrived at the front with barely enough experience to land safely, let alone survive combat against veterans flying American machines built in endless factories across the Atlantic. The bombers kept coming. He could see the escort fighters now, weaving above and around the formations. Long-range American escorts, fast and confident, waiting for German fighters to rise. They did not fear interception anymore. They welcomed it. Every German plane destroyed was one less obstacle tomorrow. The order came to attack. 40 fighters climbed into a wall of fire. Almost immediately, the sky exploded. Tracers stitched glowing lines through the air. Explosions rocked bombers, but did not break the formation. A few American aircraft fell away, trailing smoke, but for every one that dropped, dozens pushed forward without hesitation. The German pilot lined up on a bomber and fired. His rounds struck metal and glass. The bomber shuddered, fell slightly out of formation, then vanished behind a curtain of defensive fire. He broke away just in time, the airframe shaking violently as bullets tore past him. He checked his fuel. Already low. The radio was chaos. Familiar voices disappeared mid-sentence. Others shouted warnings that came too late. The escorts were everywhere now. Fast, relentless. They dove through the German fighters with practiced ease, climbing back up to safety while the bombers continued forward untouched. For the first time, the pilot understood something with absolute clarity. This was not about bravery. This was not about tactics. This was not even about technology anymore. It was about production. America could lose planes today and replace them tomorrow. Germany could not. Each fighter lost was irreplaceable. Each trained pilot gone was a wound that would never heal. He pulled away again, watching the bombers continue eastward, deeper into Germany. He knew where they were headed. Factories, rail yards, fuel plants, cities that kept what remained of the war effort alive. And tomorrow, they would come again. The realization hit harder than any enemy bullet. The war had already been decided, not in the sky, but years earlier in factories, shipyards, and training fields thousands of miles away. Today's battle was only the proof. As he turned back toward base, the sky behind him still filled with bombers, the pilot felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Certainty. Germany was no longer fighting to win the air war. Germany was fighting to slow the inevitable. And no amount of courage in 40 cockpits could stop 1,000 bombers from rewriting the future of the war. By late 1943, the scale of the air war over Europe had reached a level no German pilot had ever imagined possible. What once felt like dangerous but manageable missions now felt like standing in the path of an unstoppable storm. Every morning brought new intelligence reports, and every report sounded worse than the last. Hundreds of American bombers were assembling across England, wave after wave, stretching from horizon to horizon. And this time, they were not coming alone. German pilots climbed into their fighters knowing the odds before their engines even started. 40 fighters against nearly 1,000 bombers was not a battle. It was an equation already solved. The sky itself seemed occupied by the enemy. Sunlight reflected off endless aluminum wings, turning the clouds into a blinding wall of metal. For the first time, many pilots felt something close to certainty, not of victory, but of defeat. As the formations crossed into German airspace, the Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had left. Veterans flew alongside boys barely trained, aircraft patched together from shortages, engines pushed beyond safe limits. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was limited. Experience, once Germany's greatest advantage, was bleeding away with every mission. And still, the bombers came. The escorts were the real shock. Long-range American fighters stayed with the bombers deep into the Reich, something German planners had once believed impossible. These fighters did not break off. They hunted. They waited above the formations, diving with speed and confidence, choosing their moments. German pilots who tried to climb found themselves outmatched. Those who tried to flee were run down. The sky had become hostile in every direction. Inside the bomber streams, American crews pressed on with grim determination. Aircraft exploded. Parachutes blossomed and vanished into the chaos. Yet the formation held. Bombers filled the gaps almost instantly, as if the losses did not matter. To German eyes, this was the most terrifying realization of all. Not just the numbers, but the indifference to loss. Where Germany counted every aircraft, every pilot, America replaced them as if drawn from an endless reserve. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air with black bursts, shaking bombers violently, tearing metal apart. Still, the formations advanced. Bomb doors opened. Entire industrial districts vanished beneath smoke and flame. Oil refineries burned. Rail yards collapsed. Factories that had taken years to build were erased in minutes. Each raid cut deeper into Germany's ability to fight, repair, and even move. German pilots returning from missions spoke less and less. There was no boasting anymore, no stories of heroics. There was only silence, exhaustion, and the growing understanding that skill alone could not overcome scale. One pilot later recalled looking up after landing and seeing another formation already approaching, knowing the war in the air would never slow down long enough to recover. By 1944, the collapse was unmistakable. Training programs shortened. Replacement pilots arrived with only a handful of flight hours. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft that never flew a single combat mission. Commanders issued orders that could not be fulfilled. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots knew that even if they survived a mission, the factories destroyed below meant fewer aircraft tomorrow, fewer spare parts, fewer chances. Every bomber that slipped through tightened the noose. The sky belonged to America now, not because of superior courage, but because of overwhelming capacity. On the ground, civilians watched the formations pass overhead, day after day, with a sense of helplessness. The sound alone was crushing, a continuous thunder that seemed to last forever. For German pilots, it was worse. They were ordered to attack that thunder with numbers so small they barely registered against it. By the time Allied forces prepared to land in Western Europe, air superiority was no longer in question. It was absolute. The German pilot who once faced 1,000 bombers with 40 fighters understood the truth before most civilians did. The war was already lost in the air. Everything else was only a matter of time. What had begun as tactical engagements had turned into industrial annihilation. Germany was not being outflown, it was being outproduced. And in modern war, that difference was fatal. By the time a German pilot looked up into the sky, the war was already lost, even if no one had said it out loud yet. What he saw that day was not just a bomber formation. It was an industrial storm. 1,000 American bombers moved across the sky in disciplined streams, each one protected by layers of escort fighters that never seemed to end. Against them stood barely 40 German fighters, low on fuel, short on ammunition, and painfully aware that every loss could never be replaced. For years, German air doctrine had relied on skill, daring, and experience. Early victories had created the belief that courage and superior tactics could overcome any enemy. But this was different. This was not a duel. This was mathematics. Steel, fuel, factories, and time had all chosen a side, and it was not Germany's. The pilot knew that even if he shot one bomber down, Timor would still reach their target. Even if he survived the mission, the next wave would arrive tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. The American machine did not pause. It did not bleed out. It simply replaced what was lost and came back larger. Below those bombers lay factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and cities that kept the German war alive. Every successful American raid tightened the noose. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Spare parts disappeared. Training hours for new pilots were cut until rookies were sent into combat with barely enough experience to take off, let alone fight. The German pilot understood something the propaganda could no longer hide. Wars were no longer won by aces alone. They were won by nations that could outbuild, outfuel, and outlast their enemies. The United States had turned its entire continent into a weapon, one that Germany could not touch and could never match. As escorts swept the sky clean, German fighters were forced into desperate attacks, often flying straight into overwhelming fire. Losses mounted not just in numbers, but in irreplaceable experience. Veteran pilots fell, and with them went decades of knowledge that no training program could recover in time. Morale collapsed quietly. There were no speeches for it, no announcements, just empty airfields, grounded aircraft, and pilots who knew the odds before their wheels ever left the runway. Every mission felt less like a battle and more like a delay, a brief attempt to slow an ending that could no longer be avoided. When the bombers finally disappeared into the distance, the silence was heavier than the engines had been. The pilot returned to base, knowing he had witnessed the future of warfare. Not bravery versus bravery, but production versus exhaustion. Not heroism versus heroism, but logistics versus hope. Germany was not defeated in the sky that day by a single battle. It was defeated by scale, by the realization that no amount of courage could close the gap between 40 fighters and 1,000 bombers backed by an entire industrial civilization. Years later, historians would explain the outcome with charts, numbers, and factory output. But for that pilot, the truth was simpler and far more human. He had looked into the sky and understood, with absolute clarity, that the war had outgrown him, his aircraft, and his country. And in that moment, long before the final surrender, he knew Germany was doomed.